Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this South African Food Sovereignty Campaign workshop, Drafting the Future, Updating the People's Food Sovereignty Act, as well as the People's Food Sovereignty Policy. So the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign is celebrating its 10th anniversary of transformative grassroots-driven activism. And as part of that 10th anniversary celebration, we've been having a series of monthly online dialogues trying to reimagine the next food system. Last month, we were discussing around the land commons, and we were co-launching a book and an online version of Beyond Expropriation Without Compensation. And the month before, we had a discussion on closing the loop through food sovereignty and zero waste. And in April, our discussion was around the ocean commons challenges, risk and challenges for food sovereignty. So all of these online discussions that we've been having have also been coupled with the South African food sovereignty dialogues that we've been having around the country. We've had a dialogue in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. We've had a dialogue in the province of Gauteng, in the Western Cape province, and recently in the Eastern Cape province. All of these dialogues, as well as the workshops that we have been conducting over the past 2 years, have informed deliberations on updating the People's Food Sovereignty Act to ensure that the Act meets the challenges of our time, the risks that we are facing, and how to accelerate food sovereignty in South Africa. So today's workshop has been informed by these discussions. We have developed a draft and working version of the Act and the policy, and they are going to be launched on the 16th of October, which is World Food Day, on the National Day of Action, because we are going back to Parliament to demand the adoption of this Act. Today we have, in this workshop, we have AJ Gambhir from ASRA, and AJ is going to walk us through systemic risk in our first panel. The focus is on systemic risk assessment for food systems. One of the things SAFSC has been calling for several years is that Southern Africa, which is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase, is facing the risk of climate famines. And there are systemic risks that are being faced by our food system. So we are happy to have AJ Gambhir here from us from the Systemic Risk Assessment team. Vishwas Sadka will then respond to him as part of that first panel of accelerating systemic risk assessment for food systems. After that first panel, we'll go to the second panel on the food sovereignty policy. How we will discuss the policy and some of the new and emerging themes that have emerged as part of the dialogues and the processes of engagement that we've been having. And then after that particular session, we'll go into our third session that will be focusing on the People's Food Sovereignty Act. I'll be presenting on that particular session, and we'll go through some of the developments as well as some of the changes that we have made to the People's Food Sovereignty Act as part of the dialogues that we've been having across the country, as part of the dialogues that we've been having as part of our monthly dialogue series on thinking about and reimagining the next food system. So Dr. AJ Gambhir is the Director of Systemic Risk Assessment, a UN-led program that also Professor Vishwas Sadka, that we know as the Principal Investigator of the Emancipated Future Studies, is part of. So Dr. AJ Gambhir, thank you so much for making the time for being here with us this morning. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Pleasure to be here. Before I start, can I just check that you can all see and hear me okay? Yeah, I see some thumbs up and nods, which is an excellent start. So I'm calling you from a sunny, warm day in the southeast of England. I live just south of London. And today, this morning, a report was published in from the London Mayor's Office, and it's around climate resilience. And it's the first time that we've seen phrases like systematic or systemic interdependencies between risks being mentioned. And we're also starting to see words like cascading and compounding risks mentioned. And this is encouraging because that's the kind of work that I and my colleague, who you can see, Sarah Hendel-Blackford, and others like Vish in ASRA, think about. We're trying to think about what can harm us, not just looking at one risk turning into a crisis, but looking at lots of different risks and how they interact with each other, and how we can see compounding and cascading impacts of those. And we know that those working on the ground, whether it's in farms, whether it's in community projects, whether it's in health centres, whether it's in education, have experienced time and time again these kinds of compounding and cascading impacts. And we have to get much better at thinking about these. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully you'll then be able to see a presentation I've prepared, and that should now be up. And great. So I will proceed with that. I think someone might be off mute. There's just a little bit of background noise, which I don't think is coming from my end. But yeah, if you can just put yourselves on mute, if that's possible, then that would help. It's fine generally. There's no big problems there. So we've been thinking at ASRA, which is this newish organization. It was set up at the beginning of last year. So it's coming up to about a year and a half old. And it was set up and decided to be hosted within the United Nations Foundation, which is itself a charitable offshoot of the overall UN. And it's set up to deal with something that we call the poly crisis, which I will come to and explain, but I'm sure many of you know about and indeed are experiencing the poly crisis. So about us, we were convened to be a network of leading thinkers and practitioners across the world, looking at lots of different disciplines, but all of them thinking about systemic risks. And I'll explain what we mean by that in a minute. Our mission, as it says here on this slide, is to accelerate what we think of as transformative action to protect the Earth's ecological systems and humanity. So we're very concerned about all species and systems, not just human ones, from the threat of escalating systemic risks. So we're a global network, and we're radically rethinking risk as a way to address current and future crises. And by that, we mean that we're not simply undertaking and implementing risk management from the perspective of looking at one risk at a time and thinking about calculating its likelihood in a probabilistic manner, and then calculating its severity, and then filling in a risk matrix with a red, amber, and green color scheme. We're thinking about going to the deep drivers of risks and thinking about who these risks are going to impact and who faces risks, from what, when, and how, and who holds power, and what is the political economy of systems that create those risks. So we're trying to pursue our mission by doing four things, essentially: galvanizing a diverse transdisciplinary network of risk practitioners across sectors, disciplines, worldviews, genders, geographies, and generations. So we have a diverse network of about 50 to 60 people. Pleasure to have Vish as one of the members of that network. We're catalyzing the science and practice of systemic risk assessment, which I'll come on to explain in a minute. And we're also, and this is led by my colleague Sarah, strengthening systemic risk response capacities. And we're doing that by highlighting opportunities for action and intervention adapted to all scales and contexts. So looking deeply at what constitutes fit-for-purpose systemic risk responses to address systemic risks, and looking in all sorts of contexts and all sorts of scales, and imagining the untested as well, because I sometimes overuse the word moment. This is more than a moment. This is a process. We're in a process of polycrisis, which requires us to think deeply and transformatively about the kinds of futures that we want. So the response work stream is very much focused on moonshots and thinking through what hasn't yet been achieved in the past and what could be imaginable for the future. And then we're also increasingly advocating for strategies, approaches, and perspectives about systemic risk that build support for this kind of systems transformation that we think we need. So why are we here? I think I've already alluded to that to some extent. We know that societies and ecosystems together are facing growing risks, and that those risks are happening at the same time, and that this is no coincidence. They stem from very deep-rooted, perhaps going back centuries or even millennia, drivers, but most visible in the post-World War II Great Acceleration of socioeconomic development, which saw huge growth in material consumption and urbanization, and globally as a whole, population growth and energy use and water use, and the rise of telecommunications and transport networks. So this has brought huge benefits to many people across the world, but these benefits have been unevenly distributed, and equally, if not more importantly, they've brought with them huge environmental changes. So to ocean acidification, to carbon dioxide and methane emissions and consequent temperature rises, to deforestation, to biodiversity loss, to name just a few. So we're seeing accelerations in all of these things, and these are creating risks. And at the same time, we're becoming technologically more advanced and yet not able to institutionalize the kinds of regulations and brakes on potentially dangerous technological development that we're seeing. So this is leading to multiple overlapping crises that have resulted from the actualization or materialization of these risks, and that's become known as the polycrisis. The polycrisis is the result of these risks that are systemic in nature, and that means they have the potential to occur at the same time, interact and affect whole systems, not just one system at a time, but between systems. So in 2022, this word became quite popular. We also saw words like permacrisis and metacrisis. I think some people in the world, surprisingly not everyone, but some people in the world woke up after COVID, which happened not that long after the global financial crisis, and with many, many regional and indeed global crises in between, and realized that crises are not going away. And when we see new crises emerge at local, regional, or global scales, they are going to be polycrises, consisting of multiple different interacting risks being realized and potentially escalating each other and cascading and compounding. There are tens of different definitions of systemic risk, and we have a working definition at ASRA, which has been discussed and debated amongst our brilliant network. At the moment, our working definition is the potential for multiple, increasingly severe, abrupt, differentiated yet interconnected, and potentially long-lasting and complex impacts on coupled natural and human systems. Now, it's probably a PhD thesis to get under the skin of what all of those different words and concepts mean, but I'm sure many of them will jump out at you, and you'll understand that the kinds of things we're worried about are the multiplicity, the severity, the abruptness, the fact that there are interconnections even when things are differentiated, and the potential to do long-lasting harm to both human and ecological systems. So we're worried about everything here on the planet. We have based ourselves on principles, and you will be seeing principles springing up everywhere. You know, we've moved, I think, globally, locally, regionally, away from this rather immature notion that cost efficiency and profit maximization with a bit of redistribution sprinkled on top are the dominant ways of achieving a better society. And actually, we need to go back to basics and think about what is it we actually want from society? What do we want to achieve for society and ecosystems? And so we see systemic risks and the polycrisis characterized by those 10 features on the left-hand side in the red boxes on this diagram. And we see that the principles required to navigate the polycrisis, therefore, are to some extent the polar opposites of these things, as depicted on the right-hand side of the diagram in the green boxes. So to pick out just a few, perhaps the fifth box down, we're in a world still of reductionism, where narrow scientific methods rule to try and find ultimate drivers of change or confounding variables that explain everything. But actually, we understand increasingly that we live in a complex world full of complex adaptive systems in which results that from those systems are emergent. They can't just simply be attached to one underlying cause. So we really have to understand complexity. And below that, you can see that we also have to understand and work with and live with epistemic uncertainty. We can't simply pretend that we can list risks as known knowns and then attach probabilities to them. It is much more challenging than that. We think constantly about some other principles. So this move away from anthropocentrism, this second box down on the left-hand side, to understanding that we are all part of nature and that there isn't just the ecological system and then the human, societal and economic systems sitting on top of that, distinct from it, but very much a inherent part of it and embedded in it. And then finally, I'll just point out one more, which I've already alluded to, which is at the bottom. And this is challenging because whenever we look at systemic risks and crises, we find that it's the architecture of systems, the context of systems that inherently create those risks and crises. And so we're challenging ourselves to imagine transformation away from those current system architectures and towards something different and hopefully something better and something that is less exposed to risks and harms. So those are our principles. What I'll do over the next 5 or 6 minutes or so is introduce you to the thinking that we have developed over the last 9 months or so. So I lead a working group on systemic risk assessment. That has about 25 to 30 of these academics and practitioners from our network in it. There's a parallel working group that Sarah, my colleague, leads on systemic risk response. Similar number of people on that, and there are overlaps. These are not mutually exclusive groups. Vish happens to be a member of both, a very active and constructive member of both of those working groups. And so together in this working group, we've developed a way of thinking about systemic risks, understanding that there are many systems and many contexts, many scales, and many entities that will be subject to risks. So this is a very high-level generalizable framework and will need application, refinement, testing, and changing at different scales. So it'll be very interesting to get your reflections on whether, and if so, how, the framework could be applicable to the kind of thinking that you want to encourage to be done to make food systems, for example, more resilient. So the problem statement, and I'll just race through this because I've probably talked about it a lot already, is that risk assessment does tend to be single issue. That's well recognized by insurers, by actuaries, by security sectors, by risk assessors everywhere. But we know that it's the interconnections between risks that could be critical and damaging. And so therefore we need to get much better at mapping these risk interconnections. And before doing that, we need to more explicitly understand the systems and what they are in terms of scope, goals, power, vulnerability, and so on. And that requires great participation and stakeholder involvement so that we can get the multiplicity of views and perspectives that we need. We need to understand where and how to intervene in systems. What are the responses? What trade-offs do they create? And what vulnerabilities are there to those responses? And then finally, we need to simulate or at least imagine risk cascades and how to stop them. So we need to think about scenarios and storylines. This isn't all about computer system modeling. This is very much about talking to each other and using our imaginations and developing reasonable cases of how risks could come to pass. And actually, if we just did more of this, I think we'd be more on the front foot with some of the risks and crises that we've seen in recent times. Okay, so a lot to take in, but this is our framework, and we stand on the shoulders of giants. There are many recent attempts to develop methodological frameworks like this, and there are a few distinct aspects of our framework, although it's not new, it's not entirely original, and many of its aspects are things that people intuitively do today anyway. But we think that systematizing it and making it explicit, providing it almost as a checklist, should be useful to organizations, communities, and entities throughout the world so that they can get better at getting their heads out of the sand and seeing different risks, the cascades and crises that can stem from them. So it starts with thinking through. I've put my laser pointer on so you can see the systems. What is their political economy? What are their goals? What is their scope? What timescales do they operate on? Who do they harm and who do they serve? Who holds power in them? That sort of conversation, which needs to be a wide participatory conversation, is extremely important and is actually underplayed in almost every risk assessment framework that we've looked at so far. It's then critical to gather data and evidence to characterize things like the long-term stresses of those systems, things that could trigger those stresses into crises. So we build on work by a brilliant institute in Canada called the Cascade Institute that's developed this stress trigger crisis model. It's then about participatory systems mapping of interconnections to risk-relevant stresses, triggers, and crises, both within and outside systems, so that we can capture the full range of systemic risks. It's then about thinking through potential response measures to those risks to help meet desired goals that we've talked about in this earlier step. As I mentioned, we need to think about trade-offs and vulnerabilities and leverage points. So where to intervene in systems or between systems, what are the trade-offs of those responses, and what are the vulnerabilities of those responses? It's then about that storytelling and narrative development so that we can develop storylines of how things would develop with and without different responses, and then simulation of those in models or tools. They could be game playing exercises, they could be large integrated assessment models like the sorts of things I used to use a few years ago when I was an academic at Imperial College London, or it could be not using models at all and simply deepening the scenarios and storylines. And then it's important to implement, monitor, evaluate, and adapt, so that if we get to the stage where we implement responses, which is what we very much want to do, we make sure we keep a constant eye on them, use appropriate metrics and ways of measuring how they perform over time, and that we keep flexible and can adapt them and course correct as necessary. Apply ASRA's principles. These are derived from the 10 principles, and they are intended to be applied throughout the process. So always a reminder to us about whether we're doing this, and those principles and their translation into these SRA principles are around things like participation, representation and consideration of non-human life and ecological systems, cognitive diversity and multiple perspectives, diverse evidence, so not just quantitative data, but deep history, traditional knowledge, and other things that can be vital in informing us. Red teaming and stress testing, so challenging ourselves or getting others to challenge us to avoid biases and blind spots. Recognition and communication of uncertainty, and transparency and availability of data and methods. So this is our assessment framework, and many of you will have done systems mapping either implicitly in your own heads or explicitly. It can be very easy. It can be done with markers on flip charts. In fact, that's probably the best way to do it, because then technology doesn't get in the way. This is something I put together in about half an hour, although having done about 6 months of research into historical global entangled food and energy crises, and I captured some of the nearby and then more distant factors that led to regional food price spikes throughout the world, both in the 2008 period and also the 2022 period, driven by either geopolitical or financial or other events. So I won't go through this in detail, but just to give you a bit of a feel of the kinds of things it says, we know that when fertilizer prices go up, that can lead to regional food price increases. We know that fertilizer prices can be driven by energy demand and energy prices and food demand. We know that those things are driven by economic growth or development. We know that things like energy demand drive global warming, which then has knock-on impacts on things like agricultural productivity through extreme weather. We know that things like ecosystem health over the long term also gets damaged. We can see all sorts of interactions as well. If economic output goes down, that can lead to hunger, that can lead to social unrest, migration, political tensions, and so on. There are feedback loops everywhere, and systems mapping, even this is actually a very relatively simple systems map and misses out quite a lot of salient factors. Even this can be very useful in just opening our eyes and seeing system interconnections. But really the checklist that we want, and this is still under development, but we want to make sure that kinds of processes that we institutionalize in organizations across the world keep asking these kinds of questions around the systems of focus. What are the goals? Who do those systems serve? What systems do they connect to, and why are we concerned about their harms? Around data and evidence gathering, what data there is and what the gaps are. Around systems mapping, as I just explained, around thinking through existing response and policy types and potential new response types, and thinking crucially through this piece around what do we want to see systems transform to, around trade-offs, vulnerabilities, and leverage points, around the scenarios and storylines that could see propagation and subsidence of risks according to response and no response scenarios, and around simulation if we can do that, and then around implementation, monitoring, and evaluating how risk cascades and dynamics developing, how effective are our responses, what adaptations, revisions, and course corrections are needed, and what metrics should we use to monitor progress. So it is a lot of information. It's derived from a lot of deep thought. It's not immediately applicable to all scales without a lot of thought, and that's what the piloting process that we are now undertaking within ASRA at different scales, in different contexts, in different geographies, to try and test the application of this framework, and also a related framework on developing tools for designing and evaluating responses, which you will learn more about as the year goes on. This is where we're coming from. So that's me. You're very welcome to reach out to me in slower time at this email address, but I'd like to pause there, go back to Charles and Vish, and then discuss this all with you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, AJ, for that very insightful presentation. I'm sure there are many questions and comments that will come in the discussion. I'd now like to bring in Kishore Sadka, who is the Principal Investigator of the Emancipatory Future Studies Program, SAFSC and CJCM activist. Vish, over to you. You're still muted, Vish.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Charles. I'm just going to pull up my slides. So, as AJ has been saying, ASRA has been developing a high-level framework, and they're in the process of piloting and testing that in different context levels, etc. So this panel is about deepening that collaboration between us as COPAC/SAFSC and ASRA to kind of learn from the ASRA process around thinking through systemic risk around food systems and other interconnected systems, and also for ASRA to kind of learn from what we've been doing. So that's what my presentation is all about. So we can sort of cross-pollinate and deepen our common understanding and learn from each other. So very quickly, okay, can you see all of this, Charles and everybody? Is this clear?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So I've just framed this around, you know, how we've been campaigning and how we've been confronting sort of polycrises dynamics, or what we prefer to call socio-ecological crises of reproduction. So my first slide is just to situate, if you like, our method of trying to understand the crisis of life making and to understand risk in that context. So in South Africa, you have a very developed agro-industrial food system, sort of very sophisticated value chains, etc. And we constantly have heard that, you know, there's enough food in this country to feed everyone, i.e. we are food secure. However, South Africa was impacted by one of its worst droughts circa 2014 till about 2021. And it really revealed how many people in our society are really at the coalface of hunger. When the drought hit, 14 million South Africans went to bed hungry. And this was in a context of high inequality. And South Africa is the poster nation for inequality in terms of income concentrations at the top, wealth concentrations, etc. Hunger, as I said, was very, very serious in terms of its magnitude. Unemployment in South Africa, structural unemployment, again, is just through the charts and so on. So life making has been gridlocked in South Africa. And it's in that context the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign emerged out of a national dialogue in 2014 across all provinces, a national conference. And it's in that context we started trying to think about, well, how do we understand what we are living? And I think what comes through, and it'll become more clear, is that in our context, crisis produces risk. So it's not a one-way relationship where risk produces crisis. We have a situation where coming out of crisis, more crisis basically accentuates risks, particularly for the vulnerable and precarious in our society. And so drawing on lived experience has helped us understand this methodologically. Having public platforms to also give voice from below around these issues has also clarified things. But in the main, our conclusion is that capitalist agriculture and the food system is the systemic risk that we face. It engenders a whole set of ecological risks, everything from its carbon footprint to destruction of biodiversity and biodiversity loss, its control of water in our society, and so on and so on. So this is our Hunger Tribunal that was hosted in 2015 at Constitutional Hill, involving the Human Rights Commission in South Africa, faith-based communities, trade unions, to kind of bear witness to what's happening around the food crisis in the country. And again, we had mainly women coming to the fore to give testimony around the lived experience of hunger and crisis. Women skipping meals, eating less to keep their families going, borrowing food, etc. And of course, we took this in 2015 to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange because food prices were just going through the roof, particularly for staples. In 2016, we had drought speakouts. This is in a coal mining community in a hall where we spoke about the food crisis, but also starting to connect things up. High food prices, drought, climate, and of course, taking on the supermarkets around high food prices. And then we marched in 2016. We had a national bread march through the streets of Johannesburg. We gave memorandums to my own university, which has a hunger crisis, and so on and so on. And we drew attention to the systemic nature of this problem. The way the agricultural system is organized, the way profiteering happens in the value chains, and how prices are basically rigged upwards against poorer households and families. So what we also realized as we were doing this activism was there are interconnections that amplify systemic risk. So food price high spikes are linked to drought and climate crisis. COVID-19 also tested our society and added to hunger and water stress and so on. And so as a campaign, we took on board the cutting edge climate science. We're one of 10 hotspots heating at twice the global average. And we saw the impact of this and climate extremes during the drought on the food system. We saw it in community spaces, etc. We're also anticipating worse droughts. We are anticipating further shocks on the food system and so on. And of course, this is something that's familiar to those who work on climate. This is a very clear illustration that as temperature goes up, food systems start experiencing stress, declines, water systems, ecosystems, etc., etc. So basically, we also did a lot of food relief mapping during COVID-19. We crowdsourced data from communities to figure out how are they surviving. The state response came short. The response of capital came short. And what was very, very clear was that local solidarities in communities was what was keeping people going and alive, actually. And people pooled resources, they pooled local food sources, etc. Soup kitchens popped up, community relief efforts, etc., etc. We also mapped water-stressed communities, and we crowdsourced this data on our webpage, and we tried to understand during COVID, and this was building on our work that was done during the drought, where is water stress in South African society? And again, people got onto our webpage and they loaded their data on there, explaining to us what was happening around water systems, access, crisis, etc. So from there, our activism has tried to mature how we're thinking systemic risk and capitalist systems. And we started developing a more deeper political ecology analysis of capitalist agriculture and food systems. And these are some of the resources we developed out of 3 national food sovereignty festivals, where we've been thinking through elements of the food system, whether it's land, whether it's water, whether it's seeds, whether it's trying to understand the totality of the system and how we want to respond to this capitalist agricultural system, which is not feeding us, which is at the heart of the crisis of social reproduction and so on. And so these things are conjoined for us. And we started thinking about, well, how do we overcome this big system that's entrenched, that's locked in, and so on? How do we think in transformative terms to overcome the source of risk? And that's where we started developing the People's Food Sovereignty Act, our own vision of what the next food system should be all about, the Climate Justice Charter with the pluri-vision of addressing the legacies of apartheid, the current poly-crisis, and building a livable, just, and democratic future, and experimenting from 2017 with local pathways, food sovereignty hubs in communities, villages, towns, and cities, making the case consistently for a universal basic income and, of course, a solidarity economy. Very quickly, I mean, these tools are here. I'm not going to waste time. I know I'm constrained for time, but many in this audience is aware of this work. And as Charles said in the beginning, we are revisiting the 2018 Act through our current dialogues. This assembly is launching a revised version of this act coming out of various provincial dialogues we've had, and we want further public input and comment. The Climate Justice Charter, of course, is growing as a movement as we speak. Pathway building has really been about trying to think about commoning at various levels to bring together land, water, biodiversity, etc., and solidaristic practices to construct a new food system. And over a decade, we have various hotspots of where this activism is happening in the country. This is the heart of our methodology, which is developing a food sovereignty hub, which is a learning space of commoning knowledge, resources, and so on, to basically provide a backbone for local pathway building. My university is an example of a food sovereignty hub where we feed 1,000 people a day. We have several agroecology gardens, small-scale farmer markets, and there's a lot more to do here. But this is the methodology. This is what we've been doing to kind of uproot the old system and construct a new system, basically. And we did some modeling during COVID, and we took our case to the Solidarity Fund in South Africa that if you set up 1,000 hubs across communities in this country, we could feed at least 10 million people. Of course, we were ignored. We've made the case for a basic income in South Africa. We've had leading experts dialogue with us from all over the world. We've put together a modeling document, which we've taken to the state, and we have been, well, relatively ignored. And then, of course, a lot of work on solidarity economy. And I'm going to end there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to both presenters. I will be taking over for Charles as chair for this section of the conversation. And now we'll be moving into discussion from both the presentations that we've received from Professor Vishwa Sarkar and AJ. So to those who want to contribute, asking questions, please put the questions down in the chat. And you can also put the hand up and I will row to you and give you speaking functions so that you may ask your questions. I just want to confirm that everyone can hear me clearly and that there's no lag. Okay, that is good. So just going to the chat to see if you have any questions so far. Please do put them down. I see your hand, Onsi. We'll take you first as the first speaker.
Hi, thanks so much. Unfortunately, I need to leave soon, but I found that really interesting. Thanks to both the speakers, and thanks, Vish, for inviting me. I'm based at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University and have done quite a lot of work on social ecological resilience. So yeah, I think very many resonances with your presentation, Ajay. One question I had, and maybe it's also the kind of work that I've been focusing quite a lot on now, which is like thinking about transformation and a lot about the future. And so some of the frameworks we've been using, we actually start more with the, like, what's the vision of where we want to go, and then kind of working backwards. And I noticed in your framework, kind of some of the futuring stuff comes much later. I was just wondering a little bit about that in terms of like my own experiences. Also, if you kind of start with the present, you can get quite bogged down, even though we obviously need to understand the present if we're going to move. But I think it often it feels like looking to the future can often get a lot of agreement about where you want to go. And it actually also helps to think about what it is that we actually want to be talking about or need to be talking about in the system. So I was just wondering on your thoughts about that. And I guess also just, I feel like sometimes implicitly, if one maybe doesn't explicitly make clear what exactly we're trying to talk about, there can, I think, be a bit of a default to just wanting to maintain the current system and maybe not being like strong enough in questioning like whether the system we're in is actually the one that we want to maintain and the risks are to that system, versus thinking what is it that we're actually trying to achieve, and maybe even using some of these risks to get there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Onsi. That's such an interesting question. And this pilot process is actually for getting feedback like this and seeing if it's worth us refining the framework. And my sense is I want to, just based on your question, actually, as a minimum, tweak the framework so that in that first step that I introduced, where we're thinking about the system goals, what's the power and political economy in those systems, who do they serve, and what are their, and who's vulnerable in them. I'd love to also get in there an initial consideration, at least, of what should those systems be and what should they look like. So I really like that. It's implicit in that, in developing the storylines and scenarios later on. One thing I didn't say is that it's intended not to be a sequential set of steps, but something that's quite recursive, and that you shuttle between these steps. And in the paper that we're writing to explain the emergence of the framework and how to operationalize it, that comes through. But I still think it's really important to capture your point on getting a sense and getting that discussion of what we want these systems to be, ideally, and who they and what they should serve. So I really like that. I wonder if I might just, I don't know if she wants to be put on the spot, but Sarah is my counterpart who is thinking a lot about responses and around that transformation piece. And Sarah and I have many discussions, and we see the systemic risk assessment framework and the systemic risk response tools and methods and thinking that she's working on and leading coming together quite quickly over time so that they are done in a more integrated way. And I think in doing that, we would also bring the discussion of what we want these systems to transform to right to the very heart of this. So really can't agree with you more than that. Is a brilliant point. Thank you. I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Thank you, AJ. Just to say, I think that's a great intervention and a great question, and also thoroughly agree, particularly around the point you make around the focusing on the future is often a way to bring people together who are fundamentally maybe at odds with how to tackle current problems. Having that vision can be quite uniting, which is a critical part of this challenge, is kind of sitting with and working with so many diverse perspectives. How do we manage conflict? So I think there's a lot tied up there where considering the future in particular can help us with that. And yeah, completely agree. We're thinking about this from the context of response in terms of what does transformation actually mean? So are there functions of a system or products of a system we wish to maintain, even if we want to get rid of the system itself? Or are there things we just want to completely throw away, be they products, functions, as well as the system? These types of questions we need to be asking ourselves explicitly and openly when we talk about transformation. And I think that's really important. That's something we're picking up in our toolkit we're trying to build and test this year around response. You know, what are the kind of questions we should be asking if we want to craft responses around transformation? So really welcome your point there. And yeah, it's one we're grappling with and trying to find many different examples of futuring, imagining and transforming in different ways, and kind of picking up these problems and looking at them from multiple different perspectives to see, you know, what fits and where can we bring people essentially together before then working backwards and understanding what the pathways to that may be. So thank you for that.
No, thanks very much. And yeah, I definitely like to keep in touch as you develop things, and yeah, maybe even coordinate on some of the ideas we have also around piloting some of these ideas. So great. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Absolutely. Cool. Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Unfortunately, I have to go, but thanks so much. And I'll keep in touch. Bye.
So I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair to just throw in another question in line with the previous question and response. You gave us a very interesting visual representation of how to think at analyzing the polycrisis, that matrix with regards to how these feedback loops interact with each other. I'm sure that also if you apply that matrix or that metric at a regional level, obviously we'll start to see some interesting things. But I'm interested in asking with regards to inputs for the data that you'd feed into that analysis. What difficulties do you see in terms of how that would be applied regionally across the world? Because if we apply this to a Southern African context versus a West African context, I'm sure that we would come across a number of challenges particularly with regards to inputs. So I'm curious from your work, have you seen that already? And if you have, how have you overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's a really good question. Couple of responses to it. It's quite early days in terms of implementing this. My sense is that this is going to throw up all sorts of new data needs. And so within our systemic risk assessment work program, we have another work stream, which is around cataloging and collecting and collating all of the different databases that are out there at different scales and across the world that could be relevant to understanding and characterizing the dynamics of different risks. And that's already throwing up lots of information on the kinds of gaps that there are. We have quite poor early warning systems. I was reading an article a few weeks ago around how maybe reflecting what you were saying, Southern and Eastern African regions actually have a real lack of early warning systems around price and market data for key agricultural goods and commodities, and that needs to be rapidly filled because that prevents us from seeing risks escalating into crises at the moment. So I think on the one hand, we're going to find, and we're starting to find, quite a lot of gaps in data and broader evidence as well. This has happened in pockets of the world, but certainly the scientific community has not spent enough time talking to local communities, perhaps indigenous peoples that have been stewards of the land and have been able to provide knowledge, not through sort of obvious means like databases, but through oral knowledge or other forms of communication. So that needs, I think, to be hugely expanded as well. The second quick thing I'll say is I was quite humbled by Vish's presentation, because in a sense it was the first 2 or 3 steps of the ASRA framework, but really in action, the kind of on the ground information collecting that has been going on around hotspots of food insecurity, of water, of the different ways in which communities have been helping each other. And I don't think we see anywhere near enough of that. It could be relatively narrowly termed citizen science, but it's of course so much more than that. So I think that there's going to be, and we would definitely like to advocate for, a huge kind of explosion in the on the ground data and evidence collection that I think, you know, for all its ills, certain technologies have really democratized the ability to do that. So I think that that would be one thing that we are starting to see the need to push for. So in summary, lots of data gaps, but also lots of really encouraging signs of local on the ground data being collected, and we'd like to see more of both of those things addressed.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to take a question now from the chat, and I think this question is for, oh, sorry, Sarah, yes, you may go.
Thank you. It was only to add to AJ's last point. I think in addition to the data gaps, the other thing we are noticing is how certain systems even prevent the democratization of data collection. So legal systems requiring one to give evidence in a certain way or format and not allowing for different types of evidence gathering, either as orally, as AJ mentioned, or in collective groups or on site. So I think it's that in addition to the data gaps that AJ mentioned, we have to look at the systems themselves and what they enable us to do currently and where they need to change as well. So that's another thing from the context of response we are looking at. I'll leave it there, sorry, thank you.
Thank you for both those responses. I think it's important to say that in a world that's increasingly moving towards putting forward not methods, sorry, but things such as big data and artificial intelligence as ways of analyzing and gathering information, I think that you've kind of really put us back down foundationally in that real data does come from places and people and spaces that we're trying to analyze. So just for putting forward those other ways in which, you know, understanding and being able to interact with the real crisis also is very important for us moving forward to take into consideration and to put those things up. In line with that, I'm going to take this question from the chat, and I think it's aimed at you, Vish, from Chloe, who's asking around land bank and solidarity economy. And the question is, what percentage of land bank loans are for regenerative agriculture? And furthermore, are they successfully funding enough cooperatives towards solidarity economy, or are they funding only big commercial farmers for whose benefit? DTI development towards agroecology, and is the finance sector able to see risk clearly enough? How do we interface with the finance sector as COPAC?
Okay, well, there's a lot in that, and thank you for those engagements. I mean, to my knowledge, you know, the government institutions are really not geared around supporting sort of regenerative agriculture and including sort of newly emergent cooperatives. The one volume I flashed on the screen, cooperatives in South Africa, is a debate with officials in government, actually. There was a very interesting chapter in that volume around cooperative banks in South Africa. We have a Cooperative Banks Act, and what's clear is that the policy implementation has not linked cooperative bank development to systemic transformation. For example, the government has not worked with small-scale farmers to build cooperative banks. I sat on the Cooperative Banks Development Agency board for 6 years, and I lost that debate, actually. I was arguing that we need to really work with key social forces, homeless people's movements, and develop cooperative banks with them. Work with trade unions and develop cooperative banks with them. So they have their own capital pools that they can use to inject into transformative alternatives. The issue of the financial sector, I think we all know there's been a campaign in this country to transform the financial sector, etc. And, essentially, if you look at the drought, many commercial industrial farmers went bankrupt. They had loans with commercial banks. So we don't have a financial system that's kind of where we need it to be. And that's why in the People's Food Sovereignty Act process, we are talking about new institutions. We are talking about a food sovereignty fund, for example, that can do various things, that can help initiate sort of food sovereignty pathway building processes, that can provide working capital, that can also help farming cooperatives and other kinds of institutions scale up, etc. But we need to have dedicated institutions if we are going to be building new systems. I think that's what comes through from the People's Food Sovereignty Act. And it will be a challenge to the financial sector. We have to challenge the financial sector. And one way to do that is to diversify it, build cooperative banks, set up other instruments in policy, etc. But please engage with the drafts we are going to be launching today. More feedback, more input is welcome. Thanks.
So just want to bring that call again. If you do have a question, please raise your hand or input it into the chat and it'll be seen. I'm just checking here to see if anyone has another question for both panelists and Sarah also, as Sarah is also in the meeting, so you can address your question to Sarah. No questions so far. So I guess then I will send this question to the panelists in the meantime as people are gathering their thoughts. So I'm curious from AJ and Sarah, since we have you in the space, and I'm aware that obviously you've had Vish as part of the network, but interacting with Vish's presentation, particularly also around some of the points that Vish made about commoning, I'm curious in terms of your framework and your implementation of it. Do you foresee an ability to have some kind of measurement into how common systems would be impacted by some of those factors within the poly-crisis matrix or framework? And also, how do we start thinking about applying that poly-crisis approach towards the ways in which we understand commons and common systems, particularly from a Global South perspective? I'm pretty sure that obviously within the context of the Global North, those things would look differently, particularly in Europe, as opposed to somewhere like on the African continent. So I was very interested to find out how your structure and your framework that you're going to be implementing would look at things such as common systems.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's actually a bit similar to the question I had for Vish when I was watching his presentation, which is there's obviously a lot of thought that's been gone into the transformations that the Food Sovereignty Act is aiming towards, and the work that you're doing is aiming towards. I guess my one biggest worry is that the forces that we're currently seeing are very powerful, and they have origins in lots of different parts of the world. And has it been, or has there been much thinking about storylines or scenarios in which the kind of rebuilding of the commons that you're aiming towards would stand up against potential future crises and cascades? So one thing I would love to do, because the kind of thinking that you've been doing already, I think, as I said before, does a lot of what's in the initial steps of the systemic risk assessment methodological framework. It thinks about intersystemic links, it thinks about data and evidence, and it actually actions that and gets better data and evidence. It's thought deeply about the current systems and the goals and what those systems are for, and what those systems should be. Then I think the framework gets into this phase of sort of imagining responses, and then imagining scenarios and maybe modeling scenarios to see how risk cascade dynamics might play out, and how they might be mitigated or prepared for or adapted to or transformed away from through the response measures. So I wonder if, so the short answer to the question, Owande, is we haven't really done that thinking yet, but I wonder if, Vish, in your work, you've started thinking about, how resilient are these new transformations, or these new destinations of these transformations to, let's be honest, all of the craziness that we know we're going to see in the coming years. We're going to see, and I don't want to sort of be a merchant of doom here and start listing all of the things we're at risk from, but we're seeing loss of ownership of data and privacy. We're seeing loss of kind of understanding of how people do their tasks, as we kind of see more and more to AI and large language models and generative AI. We've seen a sort of loss of sense making and institutional trust. We're obviously seeing geopolitical conflicts with regional and local consequences. So, and of course, we're seeing a world which is committed to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, with the disproportionate impacts that brings to regions like Southern Africa, for example, and indeed many parts of what we term the global south. So this is a very long sort of soliloquy, and I apologize for it, but I wonder, do we have, and I would love to work on this with any of you, but is there any work thinking about how global commons or regional or local commons type transformations would or could stand up to a range of future crises and disruptions? Because I think that's a really important step for us to start thinking about through this framework. So yeah, I mean, maybe over to Vish. I don't know if you've done much thinking about the sort of resilience of these pathways in light of different future scenarios of risks and disruptions and crises.
Yeah. So no, that's great. So my other research project is on climate famines, and I'm going to India just to look at some of that soon, and I'm going to Madagascar, which had the first climate famine with 1 million people impacted. When I think about what we are doing and how we've been doing it, it's clear that we are trying to find an exit from the biggest vulnerability in the food system, which is deep globalization. I think deep globalization has amplified risk for food systems. I'm not saying there mustn't be international connections, but I think that deep globalization has just taken food systems over the edge, actually. And we are seeing the shocks. You've done the work, we've done the work, the different moments that punctuate these vulnerabilities. 2006, 2008, 2000, there's key shocks that have hit the system. They're multidimensional. And that reverberates back into local spaces. So I think the first important exit and shift is that one, is in a sense deglobalizing the food system. I think the second important thing I can see from my work is the power dynamics. I think systems have to be democratized. And so food sovereignty is a deeply democratic concept. It's about giving small-scale farmers, producers in communities, households. It's about transitioning the commercial industrial food system, not leaving anyone out, but transitioning them beyond mono-industrial production, deconcentration of big farms, monopolies. It's about the ocean commons transition, again, towards small-scale fishing, subsistence, etc. And I think the democratizing logics are very, very important. If we are going into the world we all know we're going into with these corporations controlling these food systems, well, we're going to have upheavals, basically. It's not going to hold together. I think the third and last thing I'll say is that what we are seeing more and more in our work, in our pathway building work and so on, which is very much part of breaking with this standard sort of template of how social scientists have thought the world, it's either state, economy, or civil society, that triadic relationship is really not relevant for what we're trying to build in terms of the renewal of whether it's the seed commons, the soil commons, the water commons, etc. We need a new quadratic conception. So yes, there's the state, there's the market, there's society, but there's also a thing called the commons. And I think increasingly drawing on indigenous knowledge and practices, local knowledge, etc., we're beginning to see a vibrancy there. We're 10 years old, but we have to scale that up. And I think that's going to make a big difference, grounding this in a kind of knowledge approach that is much more in tune, actually, to shocks, to crisis, etc., etc. So it's not like people are starting from scratch. I think this is what I'm saying. My research with women in the west coast of South Africa, highly dependent on the oceans. In some of the focus group work I did, they were saying, okay, our snook run is declining. And, for generations, we've depended on the snook run to feed our families. But we're now looking to the kind of felt, and we're foraging and we're doing other things. So there is a rich basis of knowledge of how to survive there, which comes together with the commons. And I think that, okay, it's also going to be facing the big challenges, but I think it's going to give it a kind of resilience that the dominant food system just doesn't have and won't have. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may very briefly come back on that, that's very, very interesting, and actually crystallizes in my mind that I think you termed it best there. We don't have to start from scratch. We already have no regrets transitions that we need to be implementing. So we don't have to test billions and billions of different permutations of systems and then see which performs best in huge numbers of different experiments of shocks going forward. We actually already have knowledge from history and current experience of the kinds of things which are most likely to be resilient to a number of different shocks and crises. So in a sense, you can almost fast forward and not have to go through the thinking to try and implement those. And we already know what's obvious in terms of creating harms, in terms of the deep globalization and lack of democratization in systems where food is an exemplar, but one of many different examples. Thanks.
Sarah, do you have anything to input before I move on to the next question, as I just still scan for hands in the chat?
Thank you. I just have, I guess, another question to Vish, if I may. I don't know if we have time for that. So Vish, when you were giving your presentation, as AJ mentioned, I think it is exemplary in a number of ways. And from a response perspective, it exemplifies all your work for the last 10 years, it exemplifies many of the principles that AJ presented and how they show up in the context of response. But what really struck me is your description of all that you've been doing and all the evidence you've been gathering, and then taking that to the government and just not being heard, not having a seat at the table. And yeah, I think you used the word that we were ignored, and that really struck me. So I'm still left from a response perspective thinking, and it's a bit of more of a follow-on, I guess, from AJ's last point about, do you see this transformation and this resilience that you so compellingly show us as being parallel, existing in parallel at the moment to the dominant powers and those that hold power currently? And, you know, I'm trying to work out, how do we overcome? What are the options? Or is it a question of multiple systems, growing the capacity of other systems and alternatives, and being patient? Or how can we, you know, this whole kind of the incumbent, the vested interest, the current power dynamics, how do we get around that in the context of response when everything you're doing is what we are advocating for? So
Sure. No, thanks for that. That's a great question. There's a couple of points here. One is, I think we got to keep in mind that there's a lot of space to kind of shift things. So yes, you know, we have an entrenched dominant corporate control food system, deeply globalized. You know, most of our best seafood leaves the country, our fruits, etc., etc. But alongside that, you know, you have over 6 million rural households that engage in subsistence food production. They're essentially outside of this. There are already alternative food networks and webs in urban spaces. 70% of poor working class households in township communities source their food from informal traders. They don't shop in supermarkets, okay? So you already have a lot of space outside of the dominant system. So that's my first point. The second point is, I think we are engaging in transformative politics, and this is very different from sort of revolutionary ruptural politics, where you're waiting for that break with the system and you start building from scratch, or reformist politics, which hinges on elites and the kinds of incremental, pragmatic gradualism and concessions they can make. No, we are saying, let's build that new system from below in the spaces we have, okay? And that requires a different kind of praxis, a different kind of activism. And what we are doing is doing it at two levels. We're building these pathways from below. Yes, lots of challenges around capacity, around resourcing, etc. But we're at a point where there's very important prefigurative examples that we can point to and we can learn from each other. But we're also working at the level of the macro. That's why the People's Food Sovereignty Act. But it's an act that's not state-centric. If you read our framework, it's not saying, government, you go and build food sovereignty. No, it's actually a framework driven from below. And hence we call it a democratic systemic reform. On every little provision in that act, whether it's on soils, or whether it's on water commons or ocean commons, communities, people, small-scale farmers, informal traders, waste pickers are all shaping that democratic systemic reform. The final point I'll make is that I do think, whether the elites like it or not, with the disruptions that have begun, and, you know, food inflation is going to be a very serious challenge. There's already a global debate happening. And Reserve Bank governors, etc., are making the connection between climate and increasing food prices, okay? Conservative monetarists will say, well, let's hike interest rates, which is going to be a massive shock on societies. But others are saying, well, no, we've got to think systemically now about the food system. And that means really intervening with a lot of what we've been talking about. I think the historical kind of crisis is going to meet what we're busy with. In other words, its case, its argument, its practice is going to be loud, and it's going to speak for itself. Its time is going to come. We just have to keep going in this direction. Thanks.
thank you, Vish. Really helpful and enlightening to hear that. And very important, I think, in the context of response. So thank you.
Well, now we're going to move into, oh, sorry, Charles, you may go quickly.
So sorry, thank you, Awande, for the opportunity. I'm still trying to like frame the question in my head, but it's around the epistemological crisis, the idea of a post-truth world, the idea that people have locked themselves into these epistemic bubbles and things like that. So how do you deal with that from a systemic risk analysis? And how much of a threat in and of itself is the epistemological crisis as systemic risk?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I think that's maybe the hardest question of all. There's an inherent rationality and reasonableness to putting forward a systematic series of steps or a checklist to sensibly think through what are the risks facing us and what do we do about them. And in spite of Vish's very inspirational commentary around the fact that things are happening in the existing spaces between embedded practices and institutions, it's unavoidable that in order to make these changes happen at all scales, we need to convince institutions to enact them and start thinking and acting in this systemic risk way. And at the moment, the evidence is not good, is it? That they have, you know, at a macro scale, the ability to think and act rationally. Even in institutions, there are pockets of kind of light and optimism. You know, the ways in which risk assessments are starting to change in different organizations, the ways in which the insurance industry globally and in many regions is understanding that it's basically insolvent now because of the different things that are going to hit the insured assets. So we live in a sense-making crisis, definitely, and we live in a world gone mad. And I think from a personal perspective, I think that one thing that's going to help us is shocks that keep repeating and are going to maybe shake us into our senses to start thinking and enacting in these ways better than we have been doing. But in the meantime, I guess we have to continue to fight for a sort of more sensible way of understanding the polycrisis and interacting in systemic risks and reminding people, you know, COVID did happen. COVID was a thing. People are still suffering. There are ripple effects which are strong and being felt. They're being overlaid with further compounding geopolitical crises and tensions, and that this will continue until we start sort of thinking collectively and reasonably and sensibly about it. So I'm not personally hugely confident that in the coming weeks or months we're going to see a sudden shift of people thinking in a systemic risk assessment framework kind of way. But I think we just have to keep pushing and finding allies and forces that are themselves either seeing the light or themselves starting to suffer and wanting to get out of that suffering that can work with us. So yeah, there is no option other than to keep pushing for this, because otherwise there's a much worse future scenario or set of scenarios out there. But it remains a huge challenge. I mean, one of the things we will be doing is systemic risk assessment analysis on the information and the misinformation and disinformation system at some point, and it would be very interesting to put that at the center of that kind of web of systems mapping and see what other crises that interacts with. So I'll let you know as that work develops. A very, very difficult question, but appreciate it.
Sarah?
Yeah, just maybe to add to that, I think also there's an intergenerational element to this, which helps us immensely. So I know much of the work that Vish has described and what we've been talking about in ASRA in context of response is about mental model shifts and the importance of demanding and requiring and expecting something else other than what dominant systems have given us. And I do see in that a sort of, that does give me hope. And I know, Visha's talked to me many times about the crisis of leadership that we have currently. So then I look to, what should we be learning and what should tomorrow's leaders be understanding and looking towards? And that's part of the work at ASRA as well, is to consider multiple generations and what can we already share with the next generation of risk practitioners. So away from those siloed risk, highly professionalized management approaches into more of a systemic risk assessment and response piece. So we have an element of work at ASRA which is about inviting the next generation of risk practitioners to learn from what we are learning and creating and crafting now. But that goes, that's just a very small example, but I think we need to be looking at sowing those seeds of sort of long-term mental model changes and across, a range of different spheres. So that's the only other thing I wanted to add to what AJ was saying.
I just want to ask a final question, actually, and I'm very grateful to Charles because he found a way to articulate a question I had, but I would like to ask something in continuation with this line of thought. In South Africa, we've just had a climate symposium from our government, led by our National Treasury, and one of the things that came out of that was that they spoke about the need for a disaster fund or a disaster management fund. And we in the COPAC space and in the Climate Justice Charter movement have spoken about this, I think, for a number of years now, in terms of something that we need to push more for, but we did not see coming out from our states. And in the way in which I think this speaks to what you were saying, AJ, in that these climate impacts are going to continue happening, and they're going to hammer home the fact that the things that we need to bring forward are going to come out of necessity. So in continuation with what Charles had asked along the question of the epistemic concerns, my question was going to be around the space that is going to be available or closing down in these multilateral spaces. We're particularly facing a possible second term for Trump, which means that on the global scale and in multilateral spaces that have already started to shrink from the first term and throughout COVID, will be further impacted by an administration that we already know is anti-climate action and anti-climate science. So my question is around the language of systemic risk assessment at the international and regional level. What do you see as the possibility of that being taken up quickly enough to, kind of guard against some of this impact of the space at the multilateral and global level closing down? Because the language in and of itself allows us to think at that level and then to act at that scale. And in South Africa in particular, we suffer from that in the sense that we speak of a just energy transition at this level of the states, and in the public, we see the climate crisis as being an energy crisis only. So we lack that framing of systemic understanding, but also a systemic risk assessment way of dealing with it. So what do you see as the possibility of that language being entered into the mainstream, particularly at the global and multilateral level?
Yeah, I know we don't have a ton of time in this session, and I saw a very interesting additional question from Pierre, I think, come in. So I don't know if it's inconvenient to do or incorrect to do this, but maybe I'll kind of lump the two questions together as in one response. We're in a race against time. I think the international respect for and support in the multilateral governance architecture that we've got is rapidly shrinking, as you alluded to. We are seeing a few signals that this language is coming through in thinking. So systemic risks are definitely being talked about more and more. There was a bit of a lull after polycrisis, became a bit of a trendy word for a year and then disappeared from the World Economic Forum language quite sort of rapidly after it was first mentioned at the beginning of 2023, I think. But I think that systemic risk and interconnected crises are becoming increasingly recognized. And so we're starting to see that language, and it's definitely part of ASRA's mission to make sure that that language is used and alluded to whenever we see things like climate shocks or impacts that then have knock-on effects. So there's a strong push to work both within ourselves and with allies and partners across the world and across different sectors and organizations to start embedding this language. We know that we're failing to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and we know that many of those are at risks and creating risks. And I think it's definitely incumbent upon us and our allies and partners to get this language of systemic risk understood within that. There's been a lot of criticism around how the SDG framework, even though it was conceived as a whole, has been planned and delivered in a very piecemeal way. And that's been one of the contributors to its unequivocal, really, failure in some or many parts of the world. So there's definitely much that needs to be done, and there's some space to sort of getting this systems thinking in there as we review and try to sort of save the 2030 agenda around the SDGs. This question from yeah, I mean, Vish has already answered it from the SAFSC perspective, is sort of from below, and I think it's partly the same within our work as well. I think that the danger of co-opting by neoliberal institutions, one way of pushing back against that is to try and embed this framework at all levels. Even from our best intentions, in some of our earlier work, we've been advised and accused of being a bit too top-down in our thinking. This comes from the multilateral governance level and then trickles down to the community level. And I think we've had to, well, certainly personally, I have had to recast that as, no, this goes in at all levels, and this is something that needs to be adopted at all levels of governance and even at the community level, in order that it's kind of a shared framework that isn't deviously co-opted to meet the current needs of those that currently run the systems that we are suffering from. Yeah, those would be my comments on that. But another really, really insightful and brilliant question, and also from Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I move on, Sarah, I'd just like to give you an opportunity if you have any final inputs.
Not at this stage, but just I'm really looking forward to working with you on the systemic risk response in events in a couple of months' time in September. So there'll be more from ASRA on both the systemic risk assessment and systemic risk response frameworks and tools and criteria that we are wanting to test and pilot with you. So for us, this is really exciting. So thank you so much. And this for us is the start of a kind of collective conversation where we learn from you and you tell us what works and what doesn't, because we are in our learning and iterating phase between now and the end of the year in terms of the frameworks that you've learned about today that we're crafting on assessment and response, because we want to make them fit for purpose and taken up and created together as much as we can. So looking forward to continuing the conversation and looking forward to listening and learning more today.
Well, thank you, Sarah, AJ, and Vish, for that enlightening session. I'm very excited from all this information that I've taken in, and I think that's a great way for us to start before I move on to our next speaker in the next section on the SAFSC's food sovereignty policy, which will be presented by Kawagazi Mahlalela. Kawagazi, when you're ready, we can begin.
Okay, cool. Let me just start sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see it.
Yes, it's visible.
Sorry, I just can't get oh, there we go. Okay, cool.
So it's
good
it's not showing in slideshow mode. Is that fine?
Can you guys not see it?
We can see the PowerPoints, but it's not showing the entire screen of the PowerPoint.
Okay, let me try. And now?
It hasn't moved. It might be frozen.
Does anyone else have an issue seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes. Sorry,
Yes.
Carl, maybe you wanna stop sharing and then try share again. That may fix the
Okay.
problem.
I also can't see anything.
But it is showing on your side, right, Kyle?
Yeah, it is. Let's try that again. And now?
It's still
Still
loading.
nothing on my side.
Still.
It just says you've started sharing your screen, so it's still loading.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it says it's still loading on my side, so I'll just wait maybe a little bit.
There we go.
Okay, cool. I think it is
Now.
It's working now.
So thank you for your patience. So good morning, everyone. My name is Kawekazi Mahlalela, and I'm the National Coordinator for the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. And today I'm very, very excited to present the revisions made to the CJCM Food Sovereignty Policy, Feed Ourselves Through Food Sovereignty. This policy is incredibly crucial for ensuring sustainable and equitable food systems in South Africa, and your engagement and feedback will be very invaluable as we move forward. In my presentation, I will be revisiting the original policy, discussing its key thematic areas, and then diving into the changes that have been made based on feedback from our engagements at the SAFSC community dialogues. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to a very productive conversation. So today, our goal is to revisit the original food sovereignty policy, delve into its key thematic areas, and present the changes that we've made to it. This work is not just about policy adjustments, it's about paving a way forward for our submission to Parliament on October 16th, where we aim to advocate for a more equitable and sustainable food system. To truly grasp the significance of these changes, we must understand the historical and current context of South Africa's agricultural system. Our agricultural framework is steeped in a history of violent land dispossession and systematic exploitation designed during apartheid to benefit the minority while leaving the majority in a state of food insecurity. This legacy of inequality and environmental degradation has shaped our present-day challenges. South Africa's agricultural system is characterized by a stark duality. On the one hand, we have smallholder and subsistence farmers who work smaller plots with minimal resources, producing food primarily for local markets. On the other hand, we have large-scale commercial farms and fishing operations that dominate the sector with extensive land use, significant economic investment, and intensive farming practices aimed largely at exports. These commercial practices heavily rely on modern techniques and inputs like pesticides and genetically modified crops, which, while boosting production, also leads to severe environmental and social costs. Our food system is deeply enmeshed in the global industrial food complex, which contributes significantly to climate change and perpetuates hunger and malnutrition. The impact of commercial agriculture is profound. It is responsible for a substantial share of global emissions, and its methods degrade soil fertility, necessitate the use of more chemicals, and disrupt marine ecosystems through industrial fishing practices. These activities harm the environment and threaten the livelihoods of small-scale fishers and coastal communities, exacerbating inequality and poverty. Furthermore, the industrialized food system externalized the costs of malnutrition and disease onto the most vulnerable populations, the very communities and workers who produce our food. The system drives land dispossession, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, labor exploitation, water pollution, the monopolization of seeds, and the excessive use of agrochemicals. It also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, unhealthy dietary shifts, rising food prices, and the depletion of marine resources. In light of these multifaceted challenges, our revised food sovereignty policy aims to address these systemic issues comprehensively. It seeks to promote sustainable practices, ensure fair labor conditions, protect our environment, and secure food sovereignty for all South Africans. As we move forward, our commitment is to create a food system that is productive, but also just, equitable, and resilient. As we delve further into the revised food sovereignty policy, it is essential to highlight the concept of commoning and the pathways for achieving food sovereignty, which are central to our vision for a just transition. Commoning involves the collective management and stewardship of resources. In the realm of food sovereignty, this means communities come together to manage land, water, seeds, and knowledge collectively. This approach contrasts sharply with the privatization and commodification of resources that have led to significant inequities and environmental challenges. Commoning empowers communities, it fosters sustainability, and ensures equitable access to nature and to our resources. By embracing commoning, we can strengthen social ties within communities, promote environmental stewardship, and build economic resilience. These are crucial for creating a food system that serves the needs of all and not just a privileged few. Our policy outlines several pathways to achieving food sovereignty, grounded in principles that prioritize the right to food, local control, ecological sustainability, and social justice. These pathways include supporting small-scale farmers, promoting agroecological practices, and developing local food systems. Agroecology plays a vital role in this transition. It offers a holistic approach to farming that works with nature rather than against it, promotes biodiversity, and involves local community in decision-making processes. By adapting agroecological practices, we can build resilient food systems that can withstand the impacts of climate change and other challenges. Furthermore, systemic changes are necessary to support these pathways. Policies such as land reform, seed sovereignty, fair trade, and climate resilience are critical. These measures will ensure that our food system is not only productive, but also fair, sustainable, and resilient. As we move forward, our revised policy aims to incorporate these principles and strategies, paving the way for a food system that truly serves our people's and our planet's needs. The original food sovereignty policy was developed in response to the systemic and historical challenges within South Africa's agricultural food systems. The policy aimed to address issues such as land dispossession, socio-economic inequality, and environmental degradation, which have historically plagued the sector. It was rooted in the principles of the Climate Justice Charter, which emphasized the need for systemic alternatives to combat the climate crisis and associated socio-ecological issues. The historical context of this policy is crucial. It emerged from the need to tackle long-standing pressures on our food system, pressures that have been exacerbated by climate change and historical inequalities, as I mentioned before. South Africa's constitution in sections 26 and 27 asserts the right of food for every citizen to access sufficient food, water, and social security. This mandates government action to fulfill these rights. Moreover, our industrialized food system significantly contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and environmental challenges, worsening food challenges. The original food sovereignty policy aimed to address these interconnected challenges comprehensively. Key objectives of the original policy included promoting sustainable agricultural practices, and this was done through by the policy advocating for methods that enhance soil fertility, conserve water and protect biodiversity. It emphasized reducing reliance on harmful agrochemicals and promoting organic farming techniques. It encouraged the crop diversification, was also a priority to enhance resilience against climate change and market fluctuations. The second aspect of this was to ensure equitable access to resources. One of the main goals was to redistribute land and resources to marginalized communities, particularly smallholder farmers and indigenous groups. The policy seeking to secure land tenure and provide access to affordable inputs, credits, and markets. It also supported communal land management practices that promote collective ownership and stewardship. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight was that the policy also aims to support small-scale farmers and local food systems. And this is done by building in robust local food economies, by supporting small-scale farmers through subsidies, training, and infrastructure development, which is another key objective. Strengthening local food markets aimed to reduce dependency on imported goods and industrial agriculture. And finally, promoting farmer cooperatives and networks, which is also crucial to enhancing bargaining power and sharing knowledge. Understanding the necessity of these objectives requires acknowledging the increasing frequency and severity of climate shocks. The current food system, dominated by industrial agriculture, is ill-equipped to handle these escalating climate pressures. As we confront more extreme weather events, prolonged droughts, and unpredictable growing season, it becomes imperative to design a resilient food system capable of withstanding such shocks. This policy framework is not just a set of guidelines, but a strategic blueprint for survival. It is a proactive thought experiment aimed at anticipating future challenges and equipping society with the tools needed for sustainable living. In response to the challenges and evolving socio-environmental landscape, we have made several changes to the original food sovereignty policy. These changes aim to address the gaps and enhance the resilience, inclusivity, and sustainability of our food systems. And I'm going to just run through some of the changes that we've made, the more significant ones. So firstly, we have updated data on greenhouse gas emissions in South African agriculture and also included recent statistics on food prices. These updates provide a more accurate picture of the current crisis around food, and it allows for more effective decision-making on the issue. The policy also now includes sections on pollution, specifically addressing the impacts of plastics, effluents, chemicals, and other pollutants that contaminate marine ecosystems. Additionally, the threats posed by offshore oil and gas activities have been incorporated to highlight their detrimental effects on marine life and ecosystems. Recognizing the struggles of informal traders and waste pickers, this policy has highlighted the lack of formal regulatory recognition, exclusion from trading areas, and the absence of facilities to handle extreme weather conditions for informal traders and waste pickers. This inclusion aims to bring visibility to these critical issues and promote fair treatment and support for these workers. The policy also now has expanded on addressing the loss of natural habitats due to human activities, further emphasizing the need to protect our environment and biodiversity. It also includes information on the exposure of farm workers to dangerous agrochemicals such as pesticides, insecticides, fertilizers, and herbicides. This addition underscores the need for safer working conditions and greater protection for our farm workers. To ensure a deep, just transition, we have added sectors of society such as community gardeners, households, and public spaces to the policy's goals. This expansion reflects our commitment to inclusivity and community involvement in sustainable agricultural practices. We have also expanded on the social safety net aspect of the policy, and we have included the implementation of the universal basic income grant in the sections on social safety nets. This addition aims to provide financial security and stability to all individuals, particularly those from the most vulnerable parts of our society. Addressing the challenges faced by workers in industrial scale fishing and processing, such as poor working conditions, low wages, and job insecurity, the policy presents a vision for transitioning these workers into small-scale subsistence and foraging common systems. Our strategies now comprehensively support small-scale fishers and coastal communities, incorporating biodiversity registers and the development of coastal land and ocean protocols by these communities. Informal workers across the country, simplifying legal requirements and implementing infrastructure projects. And we have also strengthened the language around commoning to better reflect our ideological commitment and engage with the issue of soil erosion to ensure the policy's language aligns with our goals. These changes represent a comprehensive and adaptive approach to addressing the evolving challenges within our food system. By updating the data and statistics, we ensure that our policies are grounded in the most current information, allowing for more effective decision-making, expanding the scope of challenges faced by oceans and fishers, as well as including the struggles of informal traders and waste pickers, highlights our commitment to inclusivity and addressing the needs of all communities. By recognizing the impact of pollution, offshore activities, and the exclusion of informal sectors, we are better positioned to create a holistic policy framework. Addressing labor issues such as exposure to agrochemicals and expanding the goals of the policy to include community gardeners, it demonstrates our dedication to creating a just and sustainable food system. The inclusion of UBI and strategies for industrial scale fishing workers further emphasizes our focus on social safety nets and equitable transitions. Our national government strategies now more comprehensively supports small-scale fishers and coastal communities, incorporating biodiversity registers and coastal protocols. The inclusion of informal trade strategies ensures that no one is left behind. Strengthening our language around commoning and addressing soil erosion ensures that our policy is ideologically aligned and robust. These changes collectively enhance our ability to respond to worsening climate shocks and a system that is resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. As we navigate the complexities of climate change and socio-economic inequalities, it becomes increasingly clear that fundamental changes are essential for creating a just and sustainable food system. Our revised food sovereignty policy reflects a comprehensive approach that addresses the multifaceted challenges we face today. By including updated data and recognizing the struggles of various communities and expanding our focus to include broader community involvement and environmental protection, we are laying the groundwork for a deep, just transition. The policy's emphasis on agroecology, common systems, and food sovereignty pathways is crucial for building resilience against climate shocks and ensuring equitable access to resources. It underscores the importance of small-scale farmers, fishers, informal traders, and community gardeners in shaping a food system that is not only sustainable, but also socially just. Through these revisions, we affirm our commitment to tackling hunger, malnutrition, and environmental degradation at their roots. We call upon all sectors of society to join us in this transformative journey as we collectively strive to create a food system that respects the rights of all individuals, harmonizes with nature, and stands resilient in the face of future challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Now we will be moving into discussion. You can just put your hands you can raise your hands to those who have joined us now in the meeting, or you can put a question to Chloe in the chat with regards to the updated food sovereignty policy. So do we have any questions to start us off? I see your hand there by AJ. AJ, you may go.
Yes, I was just struck by the just transition aspect of the policy proposals and the things that are already being done. And it was mentioned in the previous session that South Africa has been one of the targets of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, but it's all very energy focused. And it felt as though in broadening the scope of the transition that you were talking about, it starts to then overlap with a lot of the goals of Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And so my question is, and it's just not really looking for a definitive answer, but just opinions from you or others. Doing these things one at a time, is that the right way to go about it, or is that the wrong way to go about it? You know, it feels as though we need a just food transition program. It feels as though we need just water transition programs, just security transition programs. I wonder, given that those programs and partnerships would have so many overlaps in the kinds of things that need to be enacted in order to achieve equity and justice, should there be something else that's being campaigned for or pushed for, either from a South African vantage point or other countries? You know, do we need just resilience transition partnerships that seek to capitalize on the overlaps? I hope that question made sense, but I'm keen to get views from you or others on that.
Kawa, you may go, but I would also just like to fit myself in there into the queue of response, because I also do have a response to that.
So if I understood your question correctly, in terms of all of these issues are interconnected, and any kind of approach to a deep just transition has to be very conscious of the fact that our issues are connected. And so we can highlight individual struggles, but at the same time, not lose the thread of understanding that all of these individual struggles kind of go together. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Or one day you can go on.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
So the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign is in partnership with the Climate Justice Charter Movement. And the Climate Justice Charter Movement has been built around the Climate Justice Charter, which has a plurivision of alternatives with regards to the kind of society that we can build beyond those transitions. So looking at what alternative transitions or alternative systems that Vish spoke to in the first presentation of democratic systemic reforms that we require from the ground up, that can help lead and shape all these different, structures of resilience and adaptation, transformative adaptation, and transformative decarbonization is the terminology that we use instead of mitigation and adaptation. So this food sovereignty policy fits within one of those 14 systemic alternatives that the Charter has put forward. And there are other policies that are being developed also in line with this. So we're currently sitting within the SAFSC space, but it was just important for me to also give the context that this is in collaboration with a whole host of other policies that look at energy, that look at water, that look at a whole host of other things. I've also been doing research on the climate justice deal, which is a macroeconomic framework or approach, which takes all of these into a wider kind of framework and sets them together, and then speaks to how collectively they are leading and facilitating this connected transition away to a new system. So we call that a deep just transition, to speak beyond just the limited terminology of just energy transition or just transition, which has become quite shallow, speaking to how there are deeper democratic ways in which these systems need to be transitioned. So that's just some context for others also, just to understand that we may be sitting in the food sovereignty space right now, in the SAFSC space, but it's also working in tandem with all these other policy.
That's very helpful context. Thank you so much for those responses.
Are there any other questions? I might be missing those if there are questions in the chat. Just as a point to Kawe from me, I think also something which maybe you can also touch on for others, which you have alluded to in your presentation, was just some of the process in which we've taken in inputs, particularly through our workshops across the country over the past couple of months, that added to some of the perspectives that you've added into this updated food sovereignty policy.
Okay, yes, so Awande is correct. Majority of the feedback we were getting were from the dialogues that we had in Durban, Johannesburg, East London, and Cape Town, and we had very invaluable responses and feedback. A lot of the issues were very similar across the provinces. We had very similar feedback from multiple different groups, which I think was a very interesting thing to note. I think South Africans in mass are experiencing similar experiences no matter where they are in the country. Some of the more pressing concerns that came up were specifically water issues. Water is a fundamental problem for multiple different communities, and it's different in that some communities have access to water, but the water isn't necessarily clean water, or some communities don't have it at all. So we had that coming up a lot. We had feedback on gendered issues coming up a lot. So the challenges that specifically female small-scale farmers experience kept coming up quite a lot. Then we also had, as I spoke quite a bit about informal traders in my presentation, issues around informal traders came up. Again, gendered informal trader issues with females. And then we had issues around oceans, fishing communities that came up quite a lot. So it was just very interesting to be able to actually go into the communities and have conversations with people and then get like live feedback on that and how to work around that. So yes, it was just a very exciting process.
Part of those dialogues that we had also, speaking from my perspective, and Charles also, who can also add if possible, was that just speaking to also some of the systemic ways in which this food sovereignty policy fits into the wider kind of systemic approach of the CJCM and the SAFSC, was that it interconnected with work that we've done on zero waste and simple living, and dealing with consumption and how consumption waste also is interconnected to our approach and thinking around food sovereignty, and also on the rights of nature and natural climate solutions. So part of those dialogues and those perspectives that we had in interacting with people around these issues, also water stress and water issues came up also, is that this food sovereignty policy, even though the work of the SAFSC has predated and has grown over the past 10 years, has also now had this wider impact in allowing us, through thinking around food sovereignty, to begin and also contemplate and add to this other work that we've been doing around rights of nature, for example, and zero waste on my part. Charles, would you like to add anything brief, on the rights of nature also, just to expand on also how that's connected with the work on food sovereignty policy?
Yes, thank you so much, Awande. So the policy that that Kawe was presenting is basically on our thinking of how do we transition our food systems. Because the mono-industrial agriculture, first and foremost, is not going to survive climate shocks. It uses water in ways that are not sustainable. It's dependent on all these agrochemical inputs. It's based on monocultural and agricultural farming. It's destroying ecosystems and things like that. So it's basically our thinking of how do we transition the food systems. And we talk of a triple transition, as Kawe mentioned. A transition of the current commercial agricultural system, a transition of the small-scale agricultural networks, building more local networks, building more cooperatives, connecting communities to local markets, but also a transition of the commons, the ocean commons, with regard to our small-scale fishers and their rights to our ocean commons. All of it, of course, relates to our work on the rights of nature policy. As Awande said, I was leading research on that, on developing a CJCM rights of nature policy. And it's, of course, intertwined with with the food sovereignty policy that FAO is working on, because agriculture, as we know, has been one of the largest contributors of biodiversity loss, habitat destruction, the destruction of our water commons. I mean, 70% of our water, if not more, is allocated for just agriculture alone. So it's all part of the multi-pronged approach of the CJCM, of course, based on the plurivision that Vish was talking about, which means addressing the legacies of the past, dealing with the poly-crisis of today, building a livable future for the human as well as the modern human world. So based on our multi-species approach. And in the dialogues, they've been very informative towards the work of updating the policy. The policy itself was developed in consultation with communities. It was developed bottom-up to begin with. So even in the process of updating the policy, the people that developed it have to feed back on what must be added, what must be subtracted, as well as what must be strengthened. So it's the process that we are now taking forward. As Kawe said, there will be more opportunity for input on the policy before we officially launch it on the 16th of October, today being the launch of the draft policy of the Act, as well as the policy that Kawe was talking about. Thanks, Awan.
We have a question in the chat from Sandile Cele, who asks, what are the chances of successful transitioning and revolutionizing the food sovereignty without acquiring buy-in from seed producers?
Should I take that? Yeah. I'll take that.
I think, sorry, it must be addressed to the presentation.
Okay, cool. So to the buy-in without having to go through seed producers is a difficult process, and that does present a significant challenge, but it's also not impossible to get around. So if I just think based on what we're doing at SAFSC, the two things that I come up with the most, introducing the idea, I'm not sure if there's like an echo on my side, but introducing the idea of seed, like local seed sovereignty initiatives. So this would include communities focusing on saving and exchanging traditional seeds by preserving biodiversity and ensuring resilience against market fluctuations. We already have great examples of that happening on the ground. So seed sharing and creating networks around seed sharing is a great idea. But also what we're doing here is also incredibly important. Pushing for policies that do support small-scale farmers and protect indigenous seeds isn't very crucial, which is what this policy is trying to do. And so this is why having everyone in the room and pushing this on a political scale is incredibly important, because we do need policy support. I'm not sure if anyone else on my team has anything to add on that.
Charles, you may go.
Thank you so much, Kawe. I fully agree with you. Sandila, what we need to do, we need to break the power of the seed producers. The trade-related intellectual property rights that enabled the monopoly corporations to own our seed system, it's something we need to break. And that's why we talk about democratizing the food system. And part of democratizing the food system is to break the control of monopoly corporations, agri-monopoly corporations that control the process of seed production. Now, they've been doing this through a process of what one may call embedded neoliberalism, where countries like Kenya and others pass laws to criminalize the sharing and the storage of indigenous seeds. And these laws are passed under the umbrella of so-called protection of the quality of the seed system. It's one of the things that is actually leading to the protest in Kenya, because the protesters are calling for the right to store and the right to share their indigenous seeds. And that right is being taken away because as part of professionalizing the seed sector, as they put it, you are criminalized if you share and if you store seeds that are not certified. So it's been done through the process of seed certification. So part of the food sovereignty campaign globally has been a response to that capture of the seed system. because a seed is the most basic element of life. And if you capture and control the seed system, then you have captured the most basic element of life by which systems can be able to reproduce. So part of the act of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign is calling for the right of people and communities to store and to share their own indigenous seeds, breaking away from the power of these seed corporations, which, by the way, are producing genetically modified seeds that are made to be dependent on a certain kind of fertilizer, on a certain kind of insecticide, on a certain kind of herbicide. And you find that the company that is producing the seed is also the same company producing the fertilizer and the insecticide. So basically creating a monopoly bubble. Not only is it creating a monopoly bubble, but it's creating deep dependence, because a lot of these seeds, you cannot replant them. They have been created with something, I think they call it the X gene, where you can plant them for one cycle, but you cannot continue to reproduce them, to replant them as you would your indigenous seeds. So it creates that deep dependency where each and every planting season, you have to go back to the monopoly corporations to buy seeds. So it's something we've seen happening around the world, and our response to it was the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign that ensures the rights of peoples and communities to store, to share their own indigenous seeds. But it also protects farmers, because what we've seen in parts like the United States, for example, if seeds are moved by the wind into your own farm, then you can still be sued even though you did not even plant them. So part of the Food Sovereignty Act is responding to those dynamics that we have seen globally. Thanks, Alan.
I think that's a great question and response, because what you're speaking to, Charles, also is a direct indicator of some of the things we're speaking about in the first session with regards to systems that exist right now, and how we need to also ask, are we trying to maintain the system, or are we trying to move beyond to truly build resilience? And this is a clear indication of the ways in which the architecture of the corporate food system also directly is trying to service profit generation rather than actual, the fundamental aspects of growing and production of food for the sake of feeding people. So that's a very clear and direct link. So I am conscious of time. I hope that if you have any more questions on this, please write them down into the chat or save them also for the next section, which I'll be moving into now on the People's Food Sovereignty Act number 2. This is the July 2024 draft of updating the original People's Food Sovereignty Act, and Charles will be presenting on that. So when you're ready, Charles, you may bring your presentation up. So please, if you do have any questions also in relation to the People's Food Sovereignty, save them and also bring them into this discussion on the People's Food Sovereignty Act, because the two work hand in hand. Charles, you may go when you're ready.
Thank you, Awande. Just confirming if you can see my slides.
Clear.
All right, thank you. So the People's Food Sovereignty Act that we are launching today is a draft. We launched the People's Food Sovereignty Act in 2018. I'll talk more about that. But since then, we have been working on a draft, and the draft is based on updating the People's Food Sovereignty Act number 1 of 2018. So this updated one, we are referring to it as the People's Food Sovereignty Act number 2 of 2024. So let me just take us briefly through the process of where we got to the Act and the journey that the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has taken briefly. So in 2014, we had the Right to Food dialogue, where there was a decision taken to create a national campaign, and when the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign was launched. And then in 2015, we began with hunger tribunals, assessing the current state of hunger in South Africa. It brought together many people, many small-scale farmers, many informal traders, women's organizations, and so on and so forth. So there was broad mass representation of civil society. Then around 2016, when South Africa was hit by the El Nino draft starting in 2015, we had the Drought Speak Out campaign. You may have seen on the news discussions around day zero. But the truth of the matter is there are so many small towns and communities in South Africa that are perpetually living on the verge and on the edge of day zero. But unfortunately, they don't make national news because day zero became national news when it went to the large metropoles and cities like Cape Town. So in 2017, we began discussions then on the People's Food Sovereignty, the People's Food Sovereignty Act around 2016. And in 2017, we took the draft that we had of the People's Food Sovereignty Act, and we had different dialogues with national governments. Our approach to the state has always been three-pronged, and that is, there are times when we have to work with the state, there are times when we have to work against the state, and there are times when we have to work beyond the state. So this was an example of us working with the state, trying to discuss with the various government departments about the adoption of the People's Food Sovereignty Act. And then in 2018, we had a dialogue. We took the act to Parliament. As Vish said at the beginning of his presentation, that of course we were ignored. But nonetheless, in 2018, through the People's Assembly and the People's Parliament, we launched the People's Food Sovereignty Act. And then in 2019, SAFSC was working as one of the organizations that spawned the Climate Justice Charter movement. In 2020, we launched the National Food Crisis Forum. This was our response to COVID because there were so many households that were going to bed on hungry stomachs as a result of the very harsh lockdowns that were implemented and the fact that the social safety net basically collapsed. In 2021, we launched the Let's Feed Ourselves Food Sovereignty Activist Guide. And then in 2022, we accelerated and amplified our workshops around food sovereignty. In 2023, we launched the first draft of the food sovereignty policy. And then in the beginning of 2024, we've been having community engagements on updating the People's Food Sovereignty Act. So this updated version of the People's Food Sovereignty Act is informed by all these processes, from the National Food Crisis Forum, from the Let's Feed Ourselves Activist Guide that we developed, from the workshops, from the draft food sovereignty policy, and of course, it's informed by the Climate Justice Charter that we were part of developing. So this is just a picture of the bread marches that we've been having, the workshops, the training workshops on agroecology in our demonstration sites, at Wits University, as well as in other places, the hunger tribunals, the Bread Speaks Out campaign. So we have now launched the People's Food Sovereignty Act number 2 of 2024. So I'll just take us briefly through the contents of the Act. Chapter 1 is on definitions, the purpose of the Act, the application, as well as how to interpret it. The second chapter is focusing on our seed commons. The third chapter being on land commons, followed by water commons, production. And then the sixth chapter is focusing on the ocean commons. And the seventh chapter is on consumption, indigenous food commons. Finance is the following chapter, distribution, markets, zero waste and trade. And then in the 10th chapter, it's participatory mechanisms to support the food sovereignty system. Chapter 11 is on general provisions to advance food sovereignty. And then we have two schedules, one on amended and repealed laws, and the second schedule focusing on transitional arrangements that need to be put into place. So I won't go through all the definitions that we have in the Act, but just to bring to your attention some of the key concepts or terms that we define in the Act, the meaning of the commons, active citizen, agroecology, the understanding of the corporate food system, eco-social function of land, climate farmings, junk food, food forests, etc. So what is the purpose of this particular Act? So in section 27 of our constitution, the South African Constitution, it enshrines the right to food. So we have the right to food enshrined in the constitution, but unfortunately that right to food has not been realized. I mean, we have millions of households that are starving. So the purpose of this Act is to give effect to section 27 of the Constitution. Secondly, it is to facilitate the triple transition. Now, what is the triple transition? It's the transition of the current industrial agricultural system, the current industrial model that is not going to survive climate shocks, that is not going to be able to deal with climate shocks, to facilitate that transition. But secondly, to facilitate the transition of small-scale food producers, whether it's small-scale farmers, building community markets, connecting people to local markets and things like that. And then the third part of the transition is, of course, our ocean commons, protecting our ocean commons, regenerating our ocean commons, rewilding parts of our ocean commons, but also promoting the rights of small-scale fishers and building their cooperatives as well as support networks and access to markets, localized market studies, is to bring back power to people, to the food producers, to the food consumers, is to limit monopoly power. One of the questions that came out in the last discussion was around the seed producers. So this act is about limiting that monopoly power, that monopoly control, be it over our seed systems or our water systems, or be it over land. It's to promote the sustainable use of life-enabling systems, and also is to ensure that the government can provide favorable conditions for small-scale food producers. So the principles that guide this act, one is active citizenship as part of democratic participation, non-racial unity, promoting systems change, going beyond climate change to promote systems change, promoting ecological justice, producing food with an understanding of multi-species justice, a respect of the more than human world, and ending the war against nature. And basically building democracy, because localized markets are about democracy. Active citizenship is about democracy. The promotion of the commons and the process of commoning, building communal and socialized ownership, non-discrimination, building the commons public partnerships. So the second chapter, the first one was on definitions. The second chapter is on the seed commons. And it basically has three things, focusing firstly on persons and communities, their right to seeds, their right to grow, their right to propagate, their right to save, and their right to share seeds. The second part being on the restrictions on corporations, the prohibition of GM seeds, and making sure that GM seeds are banned, as well as the role of the government. From this particular chapter, we developed, if you remember in Vish's presentation, he showed some of the tools that the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has developed over the years. So one of the tools we developed is our seed saving activist tool. And it came basically from this act. It was our attempt to amplify some of the provisions of the act in helping communities on how to store seeds, how to build community-based seed banks and things like that. And then the third chapter is, of course, on the land commons. Persons' right and communities' right to land, the right of food producers to land, the role that the government must play. What rights do communities have to land? We have also taken this particular chapter and we have amplified it in the development of the land commons tool, because the land commons tool elaborates further on some of the things that are mentioned in the act, the persons and the communities' rights to land, how land should be managed, how living soil should be managed without the use of agrochemicals like pesticides, insecticides, and fertilizers. How people should use their land. It's also part of intervening in the land discussions and debate in South Africa that tend to be extremely toxic, because what we are talking about is transformative land reform that will capacitate people to be able to use the land, to sustain the land, and to protect it as a life-enabling commons rather than just a mere resource to be exchanged. And the fourth chapter is focusing on water commons. Water in South Africa is part of the Water Services Act that was passed in 1996. Is regarded as a communal good, meaning that no one can own water systems. But unfortunately, this reality is not being lived on the ground. The sense that 70% of our water resources are still allocated for agriculture. We have over 5,000 privately owned dams in South Africa, even though water is supposed to belong to all the people and not be a private resource. So it recognizes this particular section that water is a source of life, it's a public good, and that it must be prioritized for communal use to maintain the natural environment, free from corporate control. Water also must be prioritized as for food production. And the role of the government is in maintaining the water infrastructure, ensuring the democratic management of our water systems, and also helping the small-scale farmers. Many of the small-scale farmers are black and emerging farmers. Due to the legacy of apartheid, many of them don't have access to adequate water systems. And that's why everything we talk about in the CJCM and SAFSC is always based on that plurivision and understanding of our historical condition, of where we are now, and of course, where we want to be or where we want to go. And the fifth chapter is on production. And it's about enshrining the rights of food producers using agroecological methods, developing food forests, developing regenerative agriculture, indigenous agricultural knowledge, ensuring that knowledge is passed on. It's also about eliminating food waste and food loss, because there is a lot of food that is being wasted in South Africa. A lot of it ends up in the dumpster. So you see two extremes, one extreme of food waste and the other is extreme of poverty. I think it's repeated in South Africa and unfortunately all over the world. And also, what role should the state be playing in terms of the purchasing program, the promotion of ecologically sustainable ways of farming, prohibiting industrial chemical agriculture, promoting and supporting small-scale farmers as well. And then the sixth chapter is based on the ocean commons. And what we do in this chapter is to enshrine the rights of small-scale subsistence fishers, as well as the rights of communities. And we argue that small-scale subsistence fishers shall have the right to democratically use their coastland and the oceans in a way that enhances resilience, in a way that promotes ocean biodiversity. We go further to talk about parts of the ocean can be rewilded to ensure that we restore ocean ecosystems. And coastal communities shall have the right to say no to offshore oil and gas prospecting and facilities in their oceans, because increasingly that right is being threatened. Recently, Parliament and the National Council of Provinces have passed Upstream Petroleum Development Bill. They have passed the Gas Amendment Bill. All of these bills are creating the legal infrastructure that is necessary to set up offshore oil and gas in our, to basically accelerate offshore oil and gas and to disempower communities by giving the power basically to ministers and some traditional leaders to be able to override the right of communities to say no and to protect their ocean commons. So this is a response to that. And the role of government, of course, is in recognizing small-scale fishers, coastal and community biodiversity registers and protocols for coastal land and ocean use. Now, this idea of coastal communities developing biodiversity registers and biodiversity protocols in the rights of nature policy that we are working on with the Climate Justice Charter movement, we argue that these protocols and registers should go beyond the ocean commons. But we have them in the Act to ensure that communities are not only aware of their biodiversity and the biodiversity of their coastlines, but they actually have the power and right to protect it. They have local stand if necessary for them to go to court and fight against the capture of their ocean commons. And the seventh chapter is on consumption and indigenous food commons, the rights to consume nutritious and culturally appropriate food adapted to a diet locally. In other words, it's about affirming indigenous knowledge. It's about affirming indigenous culture. It's about putting restrictions on junk food outlets. It's about ensuring that there is no marketing of GM products. And it's about limiting the amount of advertisement that you see on our television screens for junk food and things like that. And we believe that the role of the state in this should be to promote indigenous foods, to crack down on junk food, to prohibit the advertising of low nutritious food, which is leading to an epidemic of a health epidemic, but also leading to an epidemic of obesity. And then in terms of finance, small-scale farmers and small-scale food producers generally should have access to finance for investment, for improvement, for risk management, and for adaptation to climate variability. And the role of the government should be to ensure that there is developmental finance to small-scale food producers that are involved in agroecology. There should be a cooperative bank to support agroecological farming and as well as worker cooperatives. And we have developed, OPEC has developed a cooperative guide that we've been discussing in the dialogues that we've been having. And it's basically about how to build cooperatives and how to ensure that cooperatives have access to finance. So many of the things that we have seen in this act, we have elaborated them further on the tools that we have developed. And Chapter 9 is on distribution, markets, zero waste, and trade. Food producers, informal traders, and communities have the right to community markets. The zero waste system and the rights of waste pickers are enshrined in the Act, ensuring that there's a promotion of localized markets, like I have been saying, but also ensuring that there is regional and international trade agreements which are in line with the Act. Because if you have international trade agreements like the TRIPS agreement, for example, which is protecting the rights of seed producers and seed monopoly corporations, you are basically embedding neoliberalism in your own laws and taking away the rights of communities to store, own, share, and distribute their own seed systems. And then the 10th chapter is about participatory mechanisms to support the food sovereignty system. And this is where we call for a national food sovereignty fund. Currently, we are warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase. We do not have a food system that can be able to meet the climate shocks. We saw what happened with the El Niño drought. It nearly decimated subsistence farmers. The prices of food skyrocketed because even the corporate food system could not deal with the impacts of the drought. So we have a national food sovereignty fund to be able to help and to assist the transition, the triple transition that I spoke about. A national food sovereignty council to empower communities, to empower activists, food sovereignty movements to be able to be part of decision makers, ensuring there's a bottom-up approach to food sovereignty, building the national system democratic planning commission, ensuring that planning is democratized and that it is not an elite practice, but it's bottom-up based in consultation with communities, building local communal councils, ensuring that we strengthen community participation in the work of the police. And then the 11th chapter is based on the general provisions to advance food sovereignty. That is food sovereignty, agroecology, education on water, ensuring there is support for research and development for agroecology, for the development of food forests, ensuring there's research for systemic risk that is facing our food systems, facing our water commons, facing our land commons as well, and the threats to the ocean commons, the threats posed by the climate crisis, but also the threats that are being posed by the fossil fuel infrastructures of oil and gas that are being currently set up. So we have two schedules, like I said. The first schedule is about amending and repealing certain laws relating to GMOs. It's about promoting agrarian reform, ensuring that municipal bylaws are in line. For example, when it comes to informal traders, you find there is a lot of discrepancy in terms of municipal bylaws One municipality will create a working infrastructure for informal traders. The other municipality is going to treat informal traders as though they are a nuisance. So ensuring there is that streamlining of municipal bylaws, ensuring that we have ocean laws that are in line with this act and they protect the rights of communities to say no. And of course, the second schedule is based on transitional arrangements, accelerating land reform, deconcentrating some of the large farms, rewilding some of them, connecting some of them to already existing national parks in order to create biocorridors for basically for animals to be able to escape climate shocks that are increasing in frequency and intensity. The phasing out of industrial farming, raising awareness about culturally appropriate food, ensuring that there is a culture of healthy food, local staples, protecting the ocean commons. And the other thing we call for is an ecocide law in South Africa. Ecocide being the large-scale and deliberate destruction of biodiversity and life-enabling commons. In South Africa, we currently have, for example, over 6,000 abandoned mines. Now, these are mines that 2,500 of them are classified as a very serious danger to the surrounding communities. Now, this is basically ecocide because if there's been no rehabilitation of the mining land, it means that land cannot be used to produce food and cannot be used for anything basically. It remains toxic, and in some instances, it remains radioactive. So this is the draft law that we are launching today. Of course, it's being circulated to all allies and partners of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, and we are calling for comments and further submissions by the 28th of August, so that by the time we take it to the National Day of Action on October 16th, it will be a quite strengthened act to advance food sovereignty. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you, Charles. Apologies, but I had a power outage. So there are questions that were previously in the chat, which I may have missed. So if I did miss your question, please just bring that to my attention. But I'll begin with what is there for me now. And the first question for Charles comes from Thokozile Mtambo, who says that mining and agriculture have always opposed each other in South Africa. Mining activities have always caused harm like air pollution, acid mine drainage, contaminated soil. All of this has impacted agriculture negatively, leading to decreased agricultural productivity, reducing crops quality, quantity, posing health hazards to both humans and farm animals. Local communities who do live around mine tailings do have access to clean land. Instead of rehabilitating and meditating, toxic soil mining companies are remining these waste dumps. So it's more of a statement than a question. But I think maybe it's a good place for us to start because we're beginning with the land in the sense of, you know, where this Food Sovereignty Act comes into place and how communities can work with it. So Charles, do you have any inputs around this type of question? And I think it's a particularly prescient question in the context of South Africa, given our history with mining, our legacy with mining, and that kind of fractured past that we've still yet to fully grapple with. How do you see this Food Sovereignty Act helping communities, mining affected communities who are dealing with this kind of context?
Thank you so much, Awande, and thank you, Thokozile. I fully agree with your the statement that you've raised. It's absolutely true. Mining in South Africa has been loosely regulated. The first fragmentation begins with the fact that a lot of mining is regulated under the Mineral and Energy Resources Act, under the Portfolio Committee on Mineral Resources. It's not entirely regulated under the NEMA Act that was passed in 1998, the National Environmental Management Act. So you see a fragmentation beginning there. And what it has led to is 6,000 mines have been abandoned by different mining companies. And these are different types of mines that had different types of tailing dams, that had different types of toxic chemicals that were coming out of their processes. And you see many communities who are living in mine-affected communities. Take Snake Park as an example, where there have been children born with deformities, and those deformities have been linked to the chemicals they've been exposed to in the tailing dams that are left behind by these mining corporations. So the Act calls for a strengthening of our laws to be able to deal with, to ensure that all those perpetrators are brought to justice. Basically, what an ecocide law would do is to go after them, ensuring there's accountability for all of these lands that have been abandoned and all of these mines that have been abandoned. I just want to bring to your attention, Awande, I think there's a question which was asked, maybe it was at the time in where you dropped off from Pumza. The question is how to avoid GMOs that affect many small-scale farmers on their indigenous seeds, for example, maize production. So one of the things SAFSC has been doing in the workshops and as part of the broader mass education around food sovereignty is that small-scale farmers should not find themselves dependent on some of these on these GMO seeds. For example, when the government is giving seeds to small-scale farmers, you find in most cases that these seeds are GMO seeds, and they are given these seeds, they are given these very toxic agrochemicals. And the moment they use these agrochemicals, they kill the living soil, the ability of their soil to produce food without chemical input. That dies. And when that happens, it sort of creates a dependency then where the soil itself is unable to produce without the use of these toxic agrochemicals. So the soil itself becomes dependent. And of course, there's a financial burden because if you look at the price of fertilizers, it's gone up by 300% or more since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So things like that require mass education of small-scale farmers, as well as other small-scale producers to be able to avoid this. But also it requires legislation to ensure that the rights of communities to store, share, propagate their indigenous seeds is not being taken away, because it's been taken away in several parts of the world.
I just have a question that I'll throw in there while I just wait for other questions for you, Charles. I think right now, in the South African context, prior to the election, and it's also something that has kind of lingered and continued post-election, is the question around the Constitution, and whether it still has relevancy today or if it's something that has to be protected. And I think that this Food Sovereignty Act is an example of ways in which we can work on using the legislative structures of our country and our democracy to enhance and also protect the rights of people, but the rights of local food producers in the context of a heating world. How do you think communities can take something like the South African Food Sovereignty Act and use it to enhance their ability to grow their work at the local level? How do they take this and work with this act to challenge municipalities and local governments to support local food producers?
Thank you so much, Awande, for that question, and it's a very important one. Vish, in his presentation, he referred to the act as a democratic systemic reform. It was developed by communities. It was developed by workers. It was developed by farm workers. It was developed by informal traders. It was developed by your small-scale food producers, your small-scale fishers, and so on and so forth, to envision what the next food system should look like, because the current one is already showing significant signs of collapse. So the Act, first and foremost, is an educational tool, because it educates around what are your rights around land, what are your rights on the water commons, what are your rights in terms of food production, what are your rights as a small-scale fisher, what are your rights around the ocean commons. So it's an educating tool. It's a tool to inform. You can use the Act, for example, to have a workshop on seeds. You can use the Act to have a workshop on water management, water harvesting and things like that. You can use the Act to discuss some of the systemic reforms that are proposed therein, like the National Food Sovereignty Fund and things like that, the development and the strengthening of cooperatives. But you can also use the Act to test the current laws that are being passed. Is the law that is being passed, for example, by your municipality in relation to informal traders, is it in line with the provisions of this Act? Are informal traders being provided with the facilities, for example, sanitation, basic sanitation facilities that they need? Remember, these informal traders provide 60% of the vegetables for communities living in informal settlements who do not shop in the large-scale supermarkets. So they are critical and essential to our food system. So you can use the Act to test not just the local legislation, but you can use the Act to measure and test the national legislation. But also the Act, I wonder, is a vision. In other words, it's a guiding principle of where we want to go. Where do we want to take the current food system? What does transformation will look like? Because we talk a lot about transformation, about systems change, but in practical application, what does that look like? And the Act answers that question.
I think what you're saying is very clear. Particularly, I think there's been a nice distinct thread from Vish's presentation on commons and the hub strategy through Klawe's presentation of the policy to what you're saying now about the Act as a guiding principle and as a roadmap also, because also the Act at least helps in seeing how we think around, as you were saying, things like zero waste and informal traders also, and how those things are connected. Pumza has a comment here in the chat saying that as leading farmers that are small-scale farmers, this presentation can assist them to produce more good and improve quality of agricultural products. Thank you for these wonderful opportunities, open-minded people to farmers. I think that's another thing that's also distinctly come through in both Klawe's presentation on the food sovereignty policy and what you're speaking about with the Act, though, is that something which gets lost in the conversations that we have again about the climate crisis and how we transformatively adapt to its impacts, but also it's something which is held within the question of the present and the current food system, is the context of the quality of food. So Vish spoke to this also with regards to how our agricultural system, in its framing and its positioning towards markets, we see the quality of agricultural products leaving our shores, the good quality, high nutritious foods going to Europe and other places, for example, with regards to citrus markets. And I'm interested with regards to your thoughts around the ways in which all these grassroots forces and contributors, how they can think around using the Act also for enhancing their ability to access quality, nutritious food now, but also within the context of climate impact and climate shocks. I think we're moving now from, in this region of the world, where our climate impacts have been one of heavy rainfall events, and we're going to be seeing ourselves moving towards drought again, which is something we've come out of from the previous decade. So yeah, how do we think around resilience, around being able to still access that quality nutritious food in that context, moving into drier conditions?
You see that the challenge with nutritious food, I wonder, begins with the seed. Because when you genetically modify a seed, there's been a lot of research about some of the downsides and some of the illnesses and diseases that genetically modified seeds have engendered and their impact on the human body. And then you find toxicity in the types of chemicals that are being used to produce the food that we are eating. Your fertilizers, your insecticides, your herbicides. There's been several research even around the impact of these chemicals that are being put in our food system, the impact on the farm workers who have to work on these herbicides, insecticides, and things like that without receiving adequate protection, without receiving adequate equipment to be able to protect themselves. And the thing is, you have such wildly spent logistics networks that we have to use chemicals in order to keep the food fresh, because we have to transport it over long distances because there are no localized markets. Again, it's more chemicals being put in our food system. And Rutumete has just posted in the chat that we are using some chemicals that are banned in other parts of the world. I think South Africa is using about 57 pesticides, which are actually banned in Europe. But ironically or hypocritically, they are being imported from Europe, which is interesting. Why ban something in your own country, but then allow for it to be exported, to be consumed by people in other parts of the world? But nonetheless, it shows the amount of work and education that we need to do. And one of the things the Act does is to not just call for culturally appropriate food, but to drastically limit these dangerous insecticides and pesticides, to remove them from our food system. And it's not going to be easy, of course, to do so. We realize and we recognize that. But if we are going to build a food sovereignty system, it's going to be a system based on agroecology. It's going to be a system based on ecosystems regeneration. Because if you don't regenerate your ecosystems, if you don't build resilience in your ecosystems, you're not going to be able to deal with climate shocks that are currently hitting our agricultural system, that are basically hitting our world. So ecosystems resilience, ecosystems adaptability, ecosystems regeneration is a key and crucial factor to building food sovereignty.
Thank you, Charles. I'm just trying to see if there are any final questions or hands before we move on to our final session on the way forward. Just in case, while anyone is thinking about to put those in, I just want to say that I think that the way in which you presented this act, Charles, and what you're saying about that roadmap, is that this is an example of what is required in a just transition, or a deep just transition, as we say. This moves us away from the narrow thinking of how we move away from our current system and our current carbon dependency towards something more broader and more complex in its ability to approach all these problems and framing them in a way which really speaks to and impacts people at the grassroots quite deeply. So I thank you for that presentation, and I hope that, oh, sorry, Charles, you got to...
Yes, Awanda. So we are going to be sharing the draft act, and we are going to be sharing the draft policy with everyone who is present here today for further input and engagement. And the tools that I mentioned, the tools that Vish also mentioned in his presentation, you can find them on the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign webpage. I've just posted the link in the chat. All the tools are there. Yeah, thank you so much, Awanda. And thank you so much for everyone for their questions and inputs. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for that presentation, and also for directing us to the tools online. I'll also make sure to just add the CJCM sites also, which then feeds back to what we're speaking about previously, about the other alternatives and the rest of our systemic perspective. So you can kind of locate and see where this Food Sovereignty Act and the Food Sovereignty Policy also fit within. So now I'm going to hand over to Kawegazi, who will be leading us in the final session on the way forward. Thank you, Kawe.
Thank you, Awande. So I'm going to close off the session today. I just wanted to mention, I noticed in the comment section, there are a couple of people who would like to get in contact with us, who seem not to be on our mailing list. So I'm going to drop my email and this Food Sovereignty Campaign's email in the chat. So if you want to reach out to us to be put on any mailing list, we can do that for you. And I just sent it now. So thank you, first of all, for all of your participation today. Everyone here is an incredibly valuable part of this process, and we are nothing without the communities that we are advocating for. So thank you for everyone being here. As we conclude, I do want to highlight our next steps in advancing food sovereignty and the policy itself and the act. We will be circulating the People's Food Sovereignty Act and policy once more through our networks, inviting comments by August 28th. This collaborative effort ensures that diverse voices shape our legislative initiatives. Additionally, I'd like to point everyone's attention to mark your calendars for October the 16th, our National Day of Action, when we return to Parliament to amplify our demands for equitable food systems. Our provisional coordinators will carry forward these discussions, engaging communities across South Africa to deepen our collective impact. Lastly, we are committed to working very closely with the team at ASRA, and we thank them for being here today as well, and our other partners to strengthen our advocacy efforts and build solidarity within the food sovereignty movement. Today, together we continue to advance our vision for a just and sustainable food future. Thank you for your dedication and your contributions. I'm not sure if there's anyone. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I wonder you can go.
No, sorry, I was actually just to ask you a question if there's any more final inputs or questions that anyone would like to ask before we close the session. Just to echo Klaus' thanks also for the time and attention everyone has given us over the past 3 hours. It's been really informative and also connecting all these issues. There's a question for you, Klaus.
In the chat. The 28th of August. That's the answer to Ray Tomato, who asked what's the date to provide feedback on the documents.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think those were the last of the inputs. Vish has something also?
No, just to say thank you. That's all. Thanks. Bye. Well done.
Well, thank you everyone for attending today's assembly webinar workshop. I'd like to thank all our speakers for their inputs, AJ, Sarah, Vish, Charles, and Kawe also for your time and for your work. And to all of you also who've been here, everyone who shared their emails in the chat, we look forward to hearing from you. This is a continual process that we've been working on. The work of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has been continuing from the past 10 years. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary. So we're really grateful to have you all here as we continue forward towards the next 10 years. So thank you everyone for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to hearing from you and with those inputs. Amandla.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.